Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and as many of you have noticed, I recently hit 1,000 subscribers, and it just so happens that the person who ended up being my 1,000th subscriber is somebody I know personally, and they kind of told me, "Hey, I'm your 1,000th subscriber." And so I said, half jokingly, but meaning it sincerely, "Okay, well, your prize is you get to pick, a topic for a video." And their choice was a comparison of the creation story in the Silmarillion with the Judeo-Christian creation story in Genesis. So I'm going to talk about the similarities and the differences between those two stories, which of course makes sense because Tolkien, being a Catholic, would have been very familiar with the Judeo-Christian story, and it's fairly clear that his worldview influences not only the Silmarillion, but the Lord of the Rings and other things as well. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting topic for discussion. So let's take a look at the similarities and differences. Unfortunately, I still haven't actually done a video dedicated to the Ainu Lindale, which is the creation story part of the Silmarillion, but I have kind of briefly mentioned it in my Silmarillion overview video, which I'll link to below. But just for the people who are not aware, let me kind of give a brief view of what happens there. We get starting off with Eru Iluvatar, who is the One and the All-Father, and again here we're kind of getting, in the beginning God. It's, we've already got a similarity. He creates the Ainur, which are, at least in some sense, analogous to angels in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then the angels he instructs in music, and then he has them play music, and teaches them various musical themes, and they play for him. And as time goes on, they get more complex, they work better together, and you get, eventually, he comes up with this one really big, majestic theme that he wants to teach them. He teaches them the theme, and then they play that theme. Just before this happens, though, we get kind of a hint of all is not well in heaven sort of thing. We get a passage about Melkor, who ends up becoming Morgoth, the great enemy in the Silmarillion. And it says that he would often kind of go alone into the void searching for the secret fire, which it tells us he can't find because it's within Eru Iluvatar himself. But he wants to make things of his own. He wants to, kind of be his own master and do that sort of thing. So we've already got hints that there's a rebellion coming and that he's going to be the Satan figure. So we get into the music that he, propounds to the Ainur. They start this theme. Everything's going well. Suddenly Melkor breaks in, trying to kind of take the music in his own direction. You get disharmony because of that. Iluvatar then breaks in with a second theme, which kind of includes Melkor's music, but kind of brings it into Iluvatar's own, as a part of Iluvatar's own music. Melkor then goes off again and tries to do another, disharmony. He starts his own thing again, and it also mentions that some of the other Ainur are kind of attuning themselves to Melkor rather than Iluvatar's own music, and that's our kind of first hint of a fall of angels other than Satan type analogy. So we've got another similarity there. Then you get Iluvatar bringing in a third theme, again trying to reincorporate what Melkor's doing, and we later actually get hints that the third theme is what brings in the children of Iluvatar, being elves and men, but that's not totally relevant for our purposes here, but I think it's worth mentioning. So at the end of the third theme, Melkor has already again tried to kind of rebel, and then Iluvatar just kind of has one giant bang of a musical note that kind of finishes the entire thing off, and it's kind of startling to everybody, but it in some sense musically finishes the whole thing, even though Melkor again is trying to disharmonize. So at the end of the music, Iluvatar kind of basically says, you're being kind of proud and trying to do your own thing, but I can still make it all work to my purposes in the end. And then he tells the Ainur, all the things that you were doing with the music, let me show you a vision of kind of what you were doing. Now, this is where it gets into the creation story, because he basically gives them a vision of world history. And I mean, like, all of world history. He shows them a vision of what Arda, the world of Middle Earth, is going to look like throughout its various ages. And he, says, gives a little more detail, talks to various Valar about the things that they find interesting and whatnot. For instance, he tells Ulmo, the Vala who is associated with waters, he says, water was kind of your special province. Melkor has tried to kind of do things with extreme heats and cold, but I've turned that into mists, clouds, snow, and ice, and these things have beauty of their own. And he does that with more than just Ulmo, but that's a good example. And it's, again, showing that idea of he's taking what Melkor has tried to twist, but still making it turn out to be not just bad, but also bringing some additional beauty into the world. And then he says, all this stuff that you're seeing, which again is just a vision at this point, he says, it's going to be. And so he says, Ea, which is let it be. And that's another name for kind of the universe in the Elven lore. And so it comes into existence. There's no longer just a void with, Iluvatar and the Ainur inhabiting it. So that's where the creation of the actual world of Arda comes in. And then certain of the Ainur, including Melkor, come into the world, and then some of them are Valar, the greater ones, and then the lesser ones are the Maiar. And then you get the Valar trying to shape the world to kind of prepare for the coming of the children of Iluvatar. Melkor's kind of trying to combat what they do, turn things to his own advantage, be the master of Arda for himself. And that's kind of as far as I want to go, really, with the creation story, because most of the rest of it gets into details of not creation, but wars between the Valar and things that they do. The only other thing that I want to mention here is you do get later stories of the creation of the stars by Varda, who is the greatest of the female Valar. I mean, they're not really male and female, but they have, kind of natures that are lean more one way or the other. And then I've already talked about the trees of Valinor and how that leads to the sun and moon later on in the mythology, and I can link to that video in the description as well. But there are elements of the creation story that are clearly different in that way, that they come much later. So that's as far as I'll go here. Now let's take a detailed look at differences and similarities. So I've already mentioned a couple of similarities as far as the angels and the analogies that they have. But what's interesting is Tolkien actually starts his creation story off with the angels, or the Ainur in his case, whereas in the Judeo-Christian story, we really only get angels as an afterthought. We don't even hear about them in the creation story at all. So that's one interesting difference. Another interesting difference, while we're on that topic, Melkor being the kind of chief angel, which is analogous to the Judeo-Christian story, he, in his marring of the music, by that process also mars the creation of the world. This is also an interesting difference, because in the Judeo-Christian story, what we get is, God creates, he says it's good. He creates, he says it's good. At the end, he still says it's all good. Whereas in Tolkien's mythology, everything is not good when it comes into being, because Melkor has already kind of put his mark on it and twisted some things that should not have been twisted. And so there's a bit of a difference there as well. And then you get into other, things about the specifics. I already mentioned the stars. The order of creation is different, in that way. Those are details that, it's kind of just better to just read the two accounts. But, the stars and the sun and the moon and that sort of thing, it's interesting in one way that Tolkien in some sense mirrors the Judeo-Christian account, in that the sun and moon come later on, after there's light, because whenever the Valar arrive, the way Tolkien kind of describes it is there's light that's kind of just floating around in a diffused sort of fluid form. It's not exactly clear what he means, because light doesn't do that in our world, but it's like they collect it and put it into things. And that's where we get the trees and then the stars and then ultimately the sun and the moon, which is interesting because it kind of parallels the Genesis story in that the sun and the moon are created after God says, "Let there be light." So that's an interesting parallel. It's not a direct parallel in the same way because the creation of the sun and the moon actually comes at the hand of the Valar, not, Eru Ilúvatar, but the timing is at least interestingly similar. So there's some kind of details about the creation itself. Let's take a look at some different kind of similarities and differences. Another interesting difference, of course, is the role that the angels or Ainur play in the creation of the world, because in the Judeo-Christian story, we really don't get any hint that the angels played any role. We don't even know when they were created relative to the creation of, the physical world. So it's like, did they have any role at all? If they did, it doesn't seem like it. It just basically says, God said, "Let there be this," and there was this. Whereas here, it's very clear that the Ainur have a direct, very important role because, like I said, Melkor, through his kind of rebellion, actually mars the creation process. But it's very different in that way. And it's interesting too because of the way that Tolkien does the whole thing through the idea of music. And of course, they played music before, but it's only at this one particular point that Ilúvatar says, "Now we're going to actually bring these things that you've been imagining into being." They're going to have being of their own. So they've been doing creation warm-up practices, I guess you could say, before that. And you get the idea that Ulmo, for instance, I mentioned his connection with water and how Melkor's rebellion affected that in the world as it is. So you get the idea that they had already been associated in some sense with the same things that they're associated with in the world, but that it was a more abstract kind of relationship. Ulmo was already thinking about water, but none of them were anticipating that water would actually be a thing that existed on its own. So that's an interesting dynamic as well. But to go back to the point about the music itself, it's just interesting that Tolkien uses music as kind of the method, and it's an orchestral arrangement essentially that they're doing because it implies the whole idea of the harmony of everything working together and just the sheer complexity of the whole thing. You have to make sure everything is timed right, playing the right note at the right time, that sort of thing. It's an interesting way of thinking about a creative and collaborative process. So I just thought that was worth mentioning as well. Quite apart from the details of, how the creation goes, chronologically, or just the details of, how it gets done, there's also kind of the literary aspect that we could look at. Both accounts are in some sense poetic, but they're poetic in very different ways. The Genesis account is poetic in the sense that, you have that on day one, God said, and there was, and God said it was good. And then on day two, God said, "Let there be," there was. You get that pattern. It's poetic in the sense that it's, repeating the same phrases. You get a very parallel structure throughout, but it's not poetic in a, what's the word I want to use? It's not poetic in the sense that it's written to be entertaining or something like that. Whereas Tolkien, his account is very poetic in a much what we might call, epic poetry, in an older style, but it's not, it doesn't technically fit the genre of a poetic epic, but it does at least seem to kind of fit within that kind of a framework in the sense that he's describing really big things in really, I don't know if metaphor is quite the right term, but the whole idea of the music being used as the orchestral arrangement and all that, you do get the idea that he is using poetic type language to get at a mythological occurrence at the beginning of the world. It's like, do we take seriously that they're really playing in an orchestra, or is that just kind of the myth maker's best approximation of what he can come up with for what makes sense for how they did it, which can't really be articulated in human terms? So it's poetic in that kind of way, because you get the idea that, it's not nearly as prosaic as God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. There it's just a direct, you know, uh, application to God's power brings things into existence. Whereas in Tolkien, you get the idea that there is a very myth making type quality to this is how it happened. He's trying to put in not an explanation in a scientific sense, but an explanation in a mythological sense for this is where it came from. Kind of like you get explanations in other mythologies of, this is where the earth came from. It came from the carcass of some giant old deity or something like that. I mean, you've got parallels in that sense, and that makes it different from the Genesis account. So in the literary sense, it has differences. They're both, like I said, poetic in a way, but in very different ways from each other. So I think that's also an interesting difference to pay attention to, because again, Tolkien is very explicitly making a myth, kind of from scratch, and he's doing it in the vein of a Judeo-Christian worldview, but he's also doing it as if he was writing from a pagan point of view, because it was kind of his goal to have a pre-Christian mythology that would fit the English Isles. So it's interesting to see how he does that and makes it very mythological, but also still manages to fit more or less within that Judeo-Christian framework. One final point, and this kind of goes back to the details of how the chronology of creation goes, and I kind of said I wasn't going to do that, but this particular thing goes back to my comment about the third theme, bringing in the children of Iluvatar. It's kind of important you get the idea from Tolkien that that third theme is what brings the children of Iluvatar in, and it's not clear exactly why it's important, but he does make clear this is something that I'm bringing up intentionally and specifically at this moment to let you know, so that there's a reason for it. Now, there's I think I have some idea of the importance of that, but I'm not going to talk about it in this video. I've got that saved for another topic, which will be very interesting when it comes along. But for the time being, what I want to point out is the Valar in the Silmarillion, and probably with the Maiar as well, do seem to have some ability to bring certain living beings into existence. For instance, we get uh, Aule kind of creates dwarves. Iluvatar has to give them their own independent spirit so that they can be a true living thing. And then you've got Yavanna, Aule's wife, who kind of creates the Ents. We're not given near as much detail on that, but then we also have some of the Valar, the Maiar, kind of seemingly bringing certain species into existence, and you can kind of maybe see either a creative process or at least a tinkering with evolution process perhaps there. We get connections with Ase, who is a Maya associated with Ulmo, for instance, seems to be the one who kind of brings swans and seabirds either into existence or is at least very closely associated with them. Kind of depends on which stage of the writing of the Silmarillion mythology you look at. But anyway, again, the problem with talking about the Silmarillion is just he was constantly changing his views on things, so you can never really nail down anything. But where I was going with this whole thing with the third theme, bringing in the children of Iluvatar, like the Judeo-Christian story, he does bring in men last, and he even brings in elves and men last compared to everything else. So you've got plants, animals, all these various different things inhabiting, the physical world before we get humans or elves on the scene. And that matches the Judeo-Christian story in the sense that, God creates everything else and then he puts man in the world. So there's an interesting parallel there. And again, I only really bring this up because of the the third theme being what brings them into existence, and the fact that we know that the third theme is important, you get the idea that the third theme is in some ways Iluvatar's final, I'm not sure what the word I want is, there's a much better word, but his final kind of rebuttal to Melkor, basically saying, you're done, and you're gonna be done through the actions of the third theme, which is what brings in elves and men. And of course that ends up being true. Eärendil, who is a product of both human and elf lineage, is the one who finally gets the Valar back involved, and they come and defeat Morgoth at the end. So there's certainly a connection there, but there's also additional connections that could be made that tie back to other things. And I don't want to get into all that detail here, but I think that there is definitely room to argue that that third theme may or may not have been what it was had Melkor not done what he did to begin with. So it's interesting to explore that idea, but that gets into pure speculation, and I'm not going to get purely speculative in this video. So for now, that'll kind of wrap up my thoughts on the similarities and differences. I'm sure that there are more details we could look at, but that's kind of the bigger ideas that I thought were interesting. If you have other things that you think should have been mentioned, then please do leave them in the comments. So that is my comparison of the Silmarillion creation story, the Ainulindale, and the Judeo-Christian creation story from Genesis. Hope that was interesting. Hope it was at least enlightening in some ways in terms of looking at the Silmarillion story from a different perspective. If you did enjoy it, please do give the video a thumbs up, share it around. Please also subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about Tolkien, the worlds he created. Or you can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. And hey, if you're the 2000th subscriber, then maybe I'll let you pick the next video topic. So there's always that. Until next time, I am the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.